At 23:41 on an overcast night in late October 1942, an 80-foot PT boat slipped along the dark edge of Guadalcanal, with two engines throttled back and the third held in reserve. The sea was flat enough to feel wrong, like the ocean was holding its breath. The lieutenant at the helm, mid-20s, 14 night patrols behind him, still waiting on that one clean, confirmed success that would make the paperwork look meaningful, kept his eyes low, scanning the waterline instead of the horizon. In the Solomons, the horizon didn't kill you. The shoreline did. The shoreline hid barges, machine guns, reef lines, and the kind of bad luck that turns a wooden boat full of gasoline into a torch before anyone can even shout a warning. Tonight's targets weren't destroyers or cruisers. They were the ugly work of war, shallow draft landing barges pushing troops and ammunition down the coast. One of those barges could haul roughly 60 soldiers in a single load, or several tons of supplies. Food, mortar rounds, rifle ammo, medical gear, everything that turned a jungle perimeter into a fighting position instead of a mass grave. If it landed, men lived on the other side. If it burned, men lived on your side. That's the part maps don't show. In 1942, logistics wasn't paperwork. Logistics was blood. The Americans joked about the Tokyo Express, but the nickname made it sound smoother than it was. Early on, Japanese destroyers and fast cruisers ran night missions down the slot, dropping off men and supplies under darkness, then vanishing before daylight air power could punish them. When air attacks and radar-directed surface fire made those fast runs too costly, the Japanese shifted to smaller craft, barges, lighters, coastal traffic. Slower. Yes. Smaller? Yes, but also harder to spot, harder to hit, and easier to replace. A barge is cheaper, the cargo is not, and the cargo, rifles, ammo crates, food sacks, fresh boots, replacement radio parts, was what kept the Japanese army from starving in the jungle. Here's where the PT crews ran into a problem so cruel it feels like a prank. The PT boat was designed around torpedoes, but torpedoes weren't built for barges. A typical PT loadout carried 4 torpedoes. Each was a heavy steel cylinder weighing well over 2,000 pounds, carrying a warhead measured in hundreds of pounds of explosive, enough to split a deep-hulled ship if it struck right. The catch was depth. A common minimum running depth hovered around 10 feet. A shallow draft barge might draw 5. Do the math. The torpedo can pass under the target without touching it. No explosion, no kill. Just a wake line sliding into darkness like your best weapon is laughing at you. It wasn't a failure of courage. It was geometry with a death penalty, and it had already cost boats. That mismatch created a vicious pattern the men at the docks could recite without thinking. The boat detects a convoy. The boat closes the way the manual says. The boat launches torpedoes that physically can't do the job. The barges open fire. The PT boat either withdraws or burns. That's not bad luck. That's a system failing under combat reality. And when a system fails often enough, it starts collecting bodies in a way that makes even veterans go quiet. The lieutenant didn't need a lecture on how fragile a PT boat was. An Elco hull was layered mahogany over frames, strong for its weight, but still wood. The deck was plywood over supports, spaced to keep the craft light enough to plane at 35 or 40 knots. Speed was its armor. Surprise was its shield. Lose either one and you were gambling your crew against machine gun tracers. A PT boat didn't need a direct finisher to die. It needed one burst into a fuel line, one spark in the wrong compartment, one moment where the boat became a moving bonfire and there was nowhere to run. In the Pacific, there were nights when men came back with holes punched through planking like someone had taken an ice pick to a coffin, and there were nights when boats didn't come back at all, just a dull orange glow on the horizon, then nothing, and an empty bunk at breakfast. The twin 50 caliber Brownings helped, on paper. A turret could throw hundreds of rounds per minute. The sound alone was a kind of comfort, the idea that you could drown the darkness in lead. Against unarmored craft, it was terrifying. Against barges with even partial steel plate around key areas, the 50 could spark and ricochet and accomplish far less than you needed in the few minutes you could afford to stay in range. And those minutes were always shrinking because barges often carried heavy machine guns of their own. At night, it didn't take a perfect gunner to hit you. It took one lucky burst into your bow, your cockpit, your engine room. By October, crews at forward bases weren't asking for better morale. They were asking for a weapon that matched the target. Something that hit harder than 50, fired faster than a single-shot cannon, and worked at the short ranges where a barge fight actually happened. Some crews tried strapping land guns to the bow. Army 37 Nimat anti-tank pieces with the wheels removed, lashed to timbers. It was better than nothing. And sometimes better than nothing is all you get in a war. But better than nothing is a low bar when the enemy is shooting back. One shot, then a manual reload under traces. In combat, those reload seconds feel like hours, and if you're trying to disrupt a convoy that might include a dozen craft moving in staggered lines, a one-shot gun isn't a solution. It's a gesture. The real problem was rate of fire. Barges were numerous, cheap, and expendable. If you wanted to break the pipeline, you had to disable multiple barges per patrol quickly before the shoreline swallowed them. That required an automatic weapon with explosive punch. And in late 1942 on Guadalcanal, the fastest place to get, that wasn't a supply ship. It was a wreck line. Henderson Field sat only a few miles inland, but it felt like another planet. It was less a base than a battered lifeline, hammered by bombing and shelling, constantly patched, constantly short of everything. The air was full of coral dust and burned oil. The ground crews worked like people who knew sleep was a rumor. Around the field lay a graveyard of aircraft. Fighters belly-landed in coral, wings snapped, fuselages cracked open, engines seized. Mechanics stripped anything reusable. Radios, instruments, control cables, magnetos. Because nothing was wasted. But many aircraft weapons remained untouched because nobody had a doctrine for turning aircraft parts into naval armament. They were aircraft guns, and therefore someone else's problem, and in war that phrase can be fatal. Among those wrecks were P-39 and P-400 Airacobra variants, fighters with an unusual design, engine behind the pilot, a long shaft under the cockpit, and a nose that could house something brutally useful, an automatic 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. That cannon family could fire on the order of 150 rounds per minute and fed from a compact magazine of about 30 rounds. In the air, that meant a short, violent burst. On the sea, it meant something PT crews had never had against barges. Explosive hits fast enough to stop multiple targets inside the engagement window. At 06:20 the next morning, barely after the patrol returned, someone walked the wreck line at Henderson and started counting usable guns like they were ration tins. 20+ wrecks scattered around the apron in different states of ruin. Many were total losses. Yet on several, that 37mm cannon assembly still sat intact. recoil system, feed mechanism, barrel, firing solenoid. Enough to gamble on. No official kit existed. No approved mount existed. No training existed. Just a simple, desperate logic. If torpedoes can't touch the barges, put a cannon on the bow and end the argument. By early afternoon, the plan formed the way plans form in real war. Quietly, urgently, and without paperwork. A handful of sailors with cutting torches and wrenches met aircraft armorers who knew where every bolt and hydraulic line lived. They had a deadline that wasn't written down, but everyone understood. Daylight. Because the barges would run again tonight, and because every day the Japanese supply line survived was another day Marines ate less, shot less, and bled more. Salvage was brutal, not cinematic. Boats seized from heat and salt. Hydraulic fluid thickened in tropical grime. Wiring corroded. Tools didn't match sizes, so men used close enough and accepted skinned knuckles as the price of speed. If a fitting wouldn't budge, it got cut. If a line cracked, it got capped and hoped for the best later. Everything happened under an invisible countdown, daylight remaining, raid risk, and the simple fact that men would be in combat with or without this gun. By late afternoon, they had 3 gun assemblies on Coral in a row. One damaged and questionable, one repairable with quick work, one that looked clean enough to bet lives on. That word, bet, matters. This was not a safe engineering project, it was a wager against death. Then came the mount, and the mount was the real gamble. A PT boat deck wasn't designed for a heavy automatic cannon slamming recoil into it at 2 to 3 shots per second. The deck flexed, the hull planed. At speed, the bow hammered waves like a fist. A mount that looked fine in calm harbor water could tear loose when the first shot fired, or bind when you needed traverse, or punch straight through the deck if the load wasn't spread properly. There's a reason navies hate unauthorized modifications. When a modification fails, it doesn't just fail quietly. It kills someone. The machine shop at Henderson wasn't a factory. It was a handful of tools and a generator that coughed whenever fuel was rationed. But it was enough to build something strong and ugly. A steel base plate wide enough to spread load. 4 mounting holes aligned to reinforced framing. A vertical pedestal pipe. A rotating collar with bearing surfaces that had to be smooth enough not to seize when heated, salted, and shaken. A yoke to cradle the cannon. Ugly welds, scorched paint, and no time to make it pretty. Combat doesn't reward elegance, it rewards what survives. If you've never built anything under combat pressure, understand what this felt like. Building a parachute after you've already jumped. Because there would be no controlled test firing. The first time that cannon fired from a PT boat would be at night, at sea, with enemy guns firing back, and with the ocean moving under you like a living thing. If you're into WWII stories where the turning point isn't a famous admiral's memo, but exhausted crews solving lethal problems in real time, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm there's still an audience for the gritty corners of history. And if you want more like it, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. All right, back to that cannon. The gun and mount reached the dock after dark. Transfer was awkward. Hardware loaded onto a small craft, ferried across black water, hauled aboard the PT like contraband. The crew measured the bow deck and marked mounting points. Under the deck, they doubled frames where they could, oak reinforcement where bolts would bite. Then came drilling, not with a powered drill, often with a hand crank, muscle, and time they didn't have. 30 minutes per hole if you were lucky. 4 holes, 2 hours disappears faster than you think when your hands are shaking from lack of sleep and you know the next patrol is coming. By 0140, the base plate was finally bolted down. The cannon was lifted into place. 200+ pounds of metal, plus recoil hardware, plus feed components, balanced on a pedestal built from scrap. The gun elevated. It depressed. It traversed, roughly, with a bit of wobble and binding. Smooth would have to wait for a second-generation mount. Tonight, moves at all was the victory. Ammunition was a new kind of nightmare. The aircraft magazines were compact and awkward, designed for aerial bursts measured in seconds. Each held around 30 shells. A gun cycling near 150 rounds per minute can chew through that in roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire. On an airplane, a burst is quick and the fight is over. On a PT boat hunting multiple barges, a fight can last 10 or 15 minutes as targets scatter and you chase into darkness. That meant reloads. Many reloads. And every reload would happen exposed, under tracers, with wet hands and adrenaline stripping away fine motor skills. So the crew stacked magazines near the gun like lifelines, knowing every reload interval was a window where the enemy could cut them apart. At 22:15 the next night, the PT boat slid out again with the cannon forward, untested, unfamiliar, and already the most important thing on the deck. Radar painted contacts at 3,800 yards, small, slow, clustered. Barges moving at maybe 8 to 12 knots. The lieutenant altered course to intercept and reduced speed again to minimize wake signature. At that moment, the war became very small. A radar screen, a compass bearing, a black silhouette on black water. Your crew's breathing. Old doctrine would have pushed him toward torpedo range, 800 to 1,000 yards, launch and turn away. Against barges, that doctrine was ceremonial nonsense. Instead, he closed for gun range. That decision mattered more than any hero speech. It meant accepting incoming fire at distances where a heavy machine gun could hit you, but it also meant the cannon could do real work. At roughly 100 yards, the lead barge saw the PT boat and opened fire. Tracers stitched the water short of the bow, then walked closer. The PT boat kept closing. At 900 yards, the gunner charged the cannon. The first shell seated. Safety off. At 800 yards, the gunner fired. The muzzle flash lit the bow deck white. Recoil hammered back. The pedestal shuddered. The deck flexed like it was alive. For a split second, every man felt the same thought. If this mount tears loose, we are dead. Then the gun cycled again. And again. The impacts on the barge weren't sparks. They were detonations, sharp flashes that tore holes, threw fragments, and started fires in places men couldn't reach with buckets. A shell struck near the waterline and opened the hull like a kicked door. Another found the engine area and turned smoke into a pouring, choking cloud. Another hit something flammable, and suddenly the barge was burning from the inside out. The first magazine emptied in about 12 seconds. The silence between magazines was the longest sound on Earth. The loader slammed on a fresh magazine. 8 seconds. 10 seconds. Under fire, it felt like eternity. While the gun was silent, enemy tracers snapped over the bow, and at least one round punched through planking close enough to make the gunner flinch without letting go of his position. Then the magazine seated with a hard click, and the cannon resumed, and the fight tilted again. One barge began to burn from the center out. Diesel fuel igniting, cargo cooking off. Men jumped into black water because staying aboard meant burning alive. You don't have to describe gore to understand how brutal that is. Darkness, fire, Salt spray, bullets still snapping, and the cold certainty that not everyone in that water would reach shore. The Pacific War didn't need blood on camera to be horrifying. It had the ocean swallowing voices. A second barge tried to turn for the coast. The PT boat swung to follow. The mount bowed slightly from heat and stress, so the gunner muscled it, and the cannon walked shells across the hull. The barge's engine note changed. Coughing, slowing. It drifted, no longer part of a coordinated supply run, no longer a successful mission. The remaining barges scattered into shoreline shadows. Not all were destroyed, but the pipeline was disrupted, and disruption was the whole point. When the PT boat broke contact and returned before dawn, there was no parade, no headline, just a short report that mattered. The aircraft cannon worked, and in a small boat war, that sentence spreads faster than any official dispatch. By sunrise, other skippers wanted the same weapon. By nightfall, crews were back at Henderson with torches. Not because they loved tinkering, because once you've seen a solution keep men alive, you don't go back to the old way. Within days, multiple boats had some version of the mount. The second generation improved quickly. Bushings scavenged from damaged gear reduced friction. Collars rotated smoother. Base plates widened. Reinforcement under the deck grew more deliberate. Gun crews learned maintenance fast because salt water eats everything. Recoil seals degraded in heat. Coral dust got into feed mechanisms. A cannon designed for aircraft service with clean hangars was now living on a wet deck at night, being fired hard, then cleaned with improvised tools under red lamps, while exhausted men tried not to think about how close they came to burning. Ammunition became the bottleneck and the obsession. If one magazine took several minutes to load by hand, and one patrol could burn through 6 magazines, 180 rounds, then your base needed a loading rhythm that never stopped. 4 loaders working 12-hour shifts might produce 40 magazines in a day if everything went well. Then those magazines had to be distributed, stored, protected from corrosion, and reloaded again after the next patrol. This is the hidden war behind the war, the fight to keep your own weapon fed. The enemy noticed quickly. Barges that had run with growing confidence began changing routes, hugging shore tighter, scattering earlier, traveling with escorts, or timing movements to weather squalls when visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. But weather cut both ways. It also made navigation mistakes more lethal, especially around reefs and unfamiliar inlets. In the Solomons, you could survive bullets and still die from one wrong turn at speed. A PT boat running hard in the dark could hit a reef and break apart in minutes. Many men who survived combat still died to the sea because the sea doesn't care who is winning. Meanwhile, the wider campaign around Guadalcanal was turning Ironbottom Sound into a grave. October into November saw brutal surface actions, air raids and ship losses stacking like wreckage under the water. In that chaos, it's easy to overlook what the barge war meant. Every convoy stopped was a little less food and ammo for enemy troops. Every convoy that landed was more pressure on American defenders. The fight wasn't just tactical, it was metabolic. Whoever fed their troops longer won the island. As reports accumulated, higher commands began to formalize what the field had already proven. The first response in these situations is usually skepticism, liability, safety, non-standard parts, training gaps. But the battlefield has a persuasive language: results. Over the following months, standardized mounts began appearing, and supply channels started pushing more consistent guns and spares forward. The concept evolved into more robust 37mm variants, and later factory installations that acknowledged what crews in 1942 discovered the hard way. PT boats weren't just torpedo platforms anymore. In many waters, they were becoming fast gunboats, and the consequences stretched forward. The shallow draft supply problem didn't vanish. It migrated. In New Guinea, coastal traffic and barge runs became essential for moving troops between isolated bases, often beyond the reach of large ships. As Allied forces advanced, the Philippines became another stage where small craft carried reinforcements and supplies wherever larger vessels risked air attack. PT units arriving later in the war brought the mindset with them: don't wait for the perfect torpedo shot, kill the small stuff fast, break the pipeline, and live to patrol again. By 1943 into 1944, the PT concept had evolved dramatically. Boats carried heavier forward guns, additional automatic weapons, sometimes rockets, turning into aggressive coastal hunters. That transformation is what people remember as the Devil Boats reputation. Not because the boats were magical, but because the crews made them dangerous in the specific fight they were actually assigned to fight. A torpedo boat that can't hit its target is a joke. A gunboat that can shred a convoy at 600 yards becomes a nightmare. My personal takeaway is blunt. This wasn't cool improvisation. It was survival overruling doctrine. The crews weren't trying to be rebellious. They were trying not to die for a manual that didn't account for 5 feet of draft and 10 feet of torpedo depth. They solved a math problem with steel, sweat, and institutional risk. And they tested it the only way war ever truly tests anything, with enemy fire coming back. There's another truth under it that people often skip because it complicates the story. Innovations like this make killing more efficient. A barge is not an empty target. It's people packed close, fuel, ammunition, and panic. When an explosive shell hits, the line between mission success and human catastrophe is a flash, a scream, and then black water swallowing everything. That's why the Pacific War was so psychologically punishing. It forced young men to make brutal decisions at short range, at night, in conditions where mercy was often indistinguishable from suicide. Still, if you want to understand why Guadalcanal mattered, those brutal decisions had consequences. A supply run denied could mean an enemy attack delayed, or an offensive weakened, or defenders holding out one more day until daylight air power could do its work. It's not glamorous, it's not clean, but it's real warfare. Pressure applied to a pipeline until the enemy position can't breathe. The victory wasn't one dramatic explosion. It was a slow strangling of resupply. By the time factory standard solutions appeared later, mounts engineered properly, installation integrated into boat design, the front line had already written the proof in smoke on the water. The official system caught up because it had to. That's the arc you see again and again in wartime. A desperate field fix becomes a pattern, then doctrine, then standard equipment that future crews assume was always obvious. It wasn't obvious. It was paid for in nights when a single lucky burst could have turned the whole experiment into a tragedy. In hours of salvage and drilling and welding, and in the quiet fear of men who knew the difference between works once and works reliably, was the difference between living and burning. If you stuck with this story, do 2 quick things for me. First, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Second, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. If you've got a family connection to the Pacific, Navy, Marines, Army Air Forces, say so. These aren't just war stories. They're reminders that history was built from real minutes and real choices made in the dark. And if you want to help keep these forgotten chapters alive, hit the like button before you go, Because every single click tells the algorithm that people still care about the gritty truth, not just the famous headlines. And one last thought. Wars love to pretend they're won by clean plans and perfect weapons. Guadalcanal proved the opposite. Sometimes you win because a crew refuses to keep losing the same way. Because someone is willing to weld an answer out of scrap. Because a PT boat goes back out into black water with an untested cannon on a wooden bow, firing anyway, while enemy barges are already moving and tomorrow's casualties are already being loaded into those hulls tonight. If you want more stories like this, stories where the turning point is a wrench, a welder, and a crew refusing to die for a manual, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. If your family has a Pacific connection, Navy, Marines, Army Air Forces, say so. These aren't just episodes. They're reminders that behind every statistic were real people on real nights, making decisions in the dark that changed who lived to see the morning.